The December wind cut through Jacob Stone's weathered coat like a blade, carrying with it the metallic scent of snow and something far worse, the unmistakable smell of death. His horse, a grizzled bay named Flint, snorted nervously as they crested the ridge overlooking what had once been the Whitmore homestead. Jacob's pale blue eyes, hardened by too many years of frontier violence, surveyed the scene below with practiced detachment, though his jaw clenched involuntarily at what he saw. The cabin stood like a broken tooth against the grey sky, its walls blackened by fire, smoke still rising in thin wisps from the collapsed roof. Around the structure, the snow was stained dark with blood, and scattered across the frozen ground lay the bodies of the Whitmore family, Thomas, his wife Martha, and their 3 children. Jacob had warned them about settling so far from Cedar Ridge, but Thomas had been stubborn, convinced that his family could make it on their own in this God-forsaken stretch of Texas frontier. "Damn fool," Jacob muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible above the wind. He'd spoken perhaps 50 words in the past month, and most of those had been to his horse. The silence had suited him ever since he'd left the cavalry 3 years ago, sick of the killing and the orders that came with it. He urged Flint down the slope, his hand instinctively checking the Colt revolver at his hip. The attack had happened recently. The blood hadn't frozen solid yet, and the bodies were still relatively fresh despite the cold. As he drew closer, Jacob could see the telltale signs of a Comanche raid, the precise scalping cuts, the ritual positioning of some bodies, the way the cabin had been systematically looted before being burned. Jacob dismounted near what remained of the front porch, his boots crunching in the snow. He'd seen too many scenes like this during his time with the cavalry, had even participated in creating a few on the other side. The knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone, cold and heavy. He moved methodically through the carnage, checking each body with the clinical efficiency of a man who'd done this too many times before. It was then that he heard it, a sound so soft and unexpected that he almost convinced himself it was just the wind. But there it was again, a tiny mewling cry coming from somewhere near the collapsed barn. Jacob's head snapped up, his senses suddenly alert. He followed the sound, stepping carefully over debris and frozen puddles of blood. Behind a pile of charred timber, partially hidden by an overturned water trough, Jacob found her, a Comanche infant, no more than 6 months old, wrapped in a beaded deerskin blanket that had somehow kept her warm despite the freezing temperatures. Her dark eyes stared up at him with an intensity that seemed far too old for her tiny face, and her small fists waved weakly in the air. Jacob knelt beside her, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he lifted the child. She was lighter than he'd expected, and he could feel her ribs through the soft leather of her wrappings. "How in hell did you survive out here?" he whispered, his voice cracking slightly from disuse. The baby made a small cooing sound, and Jacob found himself studying her face. The high cheekbones, the copper-toned skin, the thick black hair that peeked out from beneath her blanket. She was beautiful, unmistakably Comanche, and undoubtedly the child of one of the warriors who had attacked this place. But she was also just a baby, innocent of the violence that had taken place around her. As Jacob cradled the infant against his chest, his mind raced. The logical thing to do would be to take her to the fort, turn her over to the authorities. They'd find a way to get her back to her people, or more likely, they'd send her to one of the mission schools back east where they'd try to civilize her. Either way, it wouldn't be his problem anymore. But as he looked down at her trusting face, something shifted inside Jacob's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The baby reached up with one tiny hand and grasped his finger, holding on with surprising strength. In that moment, surrounded by death and destruction, Jacob felt something break open inside him, like ice cracking on a frozen river. "I reckon you're gonna need a name," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can't very well call you baby forever." He thought for a moment, then nodded decisively. "Sarah, that was my sister's name. Seems fitting." The wind picked up again, howling through the ruins of the homestead, and Jacob made his decision. He couldn't undo the violence of the past, couldn't bring back the Whitmores or the countless others who had died in this endless cycle of revenge and bloodshed, but he could save this one life. He could try to break the chain, even if it was just for one small person. "No more blood," he whispered to the baby, the words coming out like a prayer. "I promise you, little one, no more blood." Jacob tucked Sarah more securely inside his coat, feeling her small body warm against his chest. He mounted Flint with practiced ease, one hand keeping the baby steady. As they rode away from the massacre site, Jacob didn't look back. He had a promise to keep, and he intended to start keeping it right now. The snow began to fall more heavily as they headed toward Cedar Ridge, and Jacob found himself talking to the baby in soft, soothing tones, more words than he'd spoken in months. For the first time in years, Jacob Stone wasn't riding alone, and somehow that made all the difference in the world. The main street of Cedar Ridge stretched before Jacob like a gauntlet, its wooden storefronts and hitching posts dusted with fresh snow. Even in the bitter cold, folks had gathered outside Murphy's General Store and the Cattleman's Saloon, drawn by the news that had preceded his arrival. Word traveled fast in a town of barely 300 souls, and Jacob could feel their eyes on him as he rode slowly down the muddy thoroughfare, baby Sarah still tucked securely inside his coat. "That's him," he heard someone whisper. "Stone's got himself a Comanche baby." Jacob kept his eyes forward, his jaw set in a hard line. He'd expected this reaction, had steeled himself for it during the 2-hour ride from the Whitmore place. But knowing something and experiencing it were two different things entirely. The weight of their stares felt heavier than the child in his arms. He reined Flint to a stop in front of Doc Henderson's office, a small clapboard building squeezed between the barbershop and the town's only hotel. Sarah had been quiet during the ride, but now she stirred restlessly, making small sounds that Jacob had learned meant she was hungry. He dismounted carefully, one hand supporting her while his boots found purchase in the icy mud. Jacob Stone. The voice belonged to Sheriff Tom Brennan, a thick-set man with graying hair and a badge that caught the weak afternoon light. He approached with measured steps, his hand resting casually on his gun belt, not threatening but ready. "Heard you found something out at the Whitmore place." "I found someone," Jacob corrected, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "A baby girl. She needs tending to." Brennan's weathered face showed no emotion, but Jacob caught the way his eyes flicked to the bundle in Jacob's arms, then to the growing crowd of townspeople. "Comanche baby, from what I hear. That true?" "Does it matter?" Jacob asked, meeting the sheriff's gaze steadily. "She's just a child." "Hell yes, it matters," the angry voice came from behind them. Jacob turned to see Marcus Crenshaw pushing through the crowd, his face red with more than just cold. Crenshaw owned the largest ranch in the area and carried himself with the authority of a man accustomed to having his way. "That baby's kin just murdered an entire family, and you want to bring her into our town?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered crowd. Jacob recognized most of the faces, people he'd known for the 3 years he'd lived on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house, her lips pursed in disapproval. Young Billy Hawkins, barely 18, trying to look tough as he nodded along with Crenshaw's words. Even Father Mackenzie, the town's priest, stood with his arms crossed, his usually kind face troubled. "The baby didn't murder anyone," Jacob said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume. "She's maybe 6 months old. But she's one of them." Crenshaw stepped closer, his voice rising. "Her people killed the Whitmores, scalped them like animals. And you want to raise her up so she can do the same to our children someday?" Sarah chose that moment to cry, a thin, hungry wail that cut through the cold air like a knife. Jacob instinctively began to rock her gently, making soft, shushing sounds. The gesture was so natural, so protective, that several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. "Look at him," whispered Mrs. Patterson to her neighbor, acting like it's his own flesh and blood. Doc Henderson emerged from his office, drawn by the commotion. He was a small, precise man, with steel-rimmed spectacles and hands that Jacob had seen work miracles on wounded cowboys and sick children alike. "What's all this noise about?" he asked, then stopped short when he saw the baby in Jacob's arms. "Doc," Jacob said, relief evident in his voice. "She needs looking at. Been out in the cold and she's hungry." Henderson studied Jacob's face for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "Bring her inside." He turned to address the crowd. "The rest of you find somewhere else to be. This is a medical matter." "Like hell it is," Crenshaw snarled. "This is a town matter. We all have a say in whether that thing stays here." "She's not a thing," Jacob said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "She's a baby, and she stays with me." "Says who?" Crenshaw demanded. "You got no legal right to that child. She belongs with her own people, or with the authorities." Sheriff Brennan stepped forward, his voice carefully neutral. "Jacob, Crenshaw's got a point. Legally speaking, you can't just take a child, even under these circumstances. There are procedures." "To hell with procedures," Jacob interrupted, his usual quiet demeanor cracking. "I found her alive when she should have been dead. I made her a promise, and I intend to keep it." "What kind of promise?" Father Mackenzie asked, his voice gentle but probing. Jacob looked around at the circle of faces, some hostile, some curious, all judgmental. He thought about lying, about making up something that would satisfy their need for conventional explanations, but as Sarah's small hand gripped his finger through the blanket, he found himself telling the truth. "I promised her no more blood," he said simply. "No more killing, no more revenge. I'm going to raise her to be better than all of this." The silence that followed was profound. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, leaving only the soft sounds of Sarah's breathing and the distant creak of frozen wood. "You're a damn fool, Jacob Stone," Crenshaw said finally. "That baby's got Comanche blood in her veins. You can't change what she is." "Maybe not," Jacob replied, his voice steady again. "But I can change what she becomes." Doc Henderson cleared his throat. "Well, whatever you decide to do about the future, this child needs medical attention now. Jacob, bring her inside. The rest of you go home. There's nothing more to see here." As the crowd began to disperse, Jacob caught Sheriff Brennan's arm. "Tom, I need you to know. I'm not looking for trouble. I just want to do right by this little girl." Brennan studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I know you, Jacob. You're a good man, even if you are stubborn as a mule. But this isn't going to be easy. There are folks who won't stand for it." "I know," Jacob said, "but I'm not backing down." As he followed Doc Henderson into the warm interior of the medical office, Jacob could hear the voices of the townspeople as they walked away, some arguing, some planning, all of them talking about him and the baby he decided to protect. He knew this was only the beginning of the fight, but for now Sarah was safe, and that was enough. 3 weeks had passed since Jacob brought Sarah to Cedar Ridge, and the novelty of the situation had worn thin for everyone involved. Jacob's small cabin, 2 miles outside of town, had become a fortress of sorts, not because he'd barricaded it, but because the isolation felt necessary. The baby had thrived under Doc Henderson's care, growing stronger and more alert each day, but Jacob himself looked haggard from sleepless nights and the constant worry that someone might try to take her away. The knock on his door came just after dawn, sharp and insistent. Jacob's hand went automatically to his Colt as he peered through the frost-covered window. A woman stood on his porch, tall and angular, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. He recognized her immediately. Elena Vasquez, the Mexican woman who ran the town's only boarding house and restaurant. She was holding a covered basket and had the determined look of someone who wouldn't be easily turned away. "Mrs. Vasquez," Jacob said as he opened the door, Sarah cradled in his left arm. "Bit early for visiting, isn't it?" "Early is when the work gets done, Mr. Stone," she replied in accented English, her dark eyes taking in his rumpled clothes and unshaven face. "You look like hell, and that baby looks like she could use some proper care." Jacob bristled slightly. "She's getting proper care. Doc Henderson says she's doing fine." "Doc Henderson knows medicine," Elena said, pushing past him into the cabin with the confidence of someone accustomed to taking charge. "But he doesn't know babies. When's the last time you slept more than 2 hours straight?" Jacob wanted to argue, but the truth was he couldn't remember. Sarah had been restless lately, crying at odd hours, and he'd been too nervous to sleep deeply even when she was quiet. The cabin, usually neat despite its sparse furnishings, looked like a battlefield. Dirty dishes stacked by the wash basin, clothes scattered across the single chair, empty bottles that had once held milk scattered on the table. "I brought food," Eleanor said, setting her basket on the table and immediately beginning to unpack it. "And some things the baby needs. My youngest is 15 now, but I remember what it was like." "I can't pay you," Jacob said quietly, his pride making the admission difficult. Elena stopped her unpacking and looked at him with something that might have been amusement. "Did I ask for payment? Besides, you think you're the only one in this town who knows what it's like to be unwanted." Jacob studied her face, noting the hard lines around her eyes, the way she held herself with defensive pride. He'd never really thought about Elena's story. She'd been in Cedar Ridge when he arrived, running her business efficiently and keeping mostly to herself. But now he remembered the whispered comments, the way some of the townspeople treated her with barely concealed contempt. "They don't much like Mexicans here either," she continued, pulling out a pot of what smelled like beef stew, "especially Mexican women who own property and speak their minds." "But I've been here 12 years and I'm not going anywhere." Sarah made a soft sound, and Elena's expression softened as she looked at the baby. "She's beautiful," she said simply. "Whatever her blood, she's just a child who needs love and care." "That's what I keep telling folks," Jacob said, sinking into his chair with exhaustion. "But they don't want to hear it. Some don't, Elena agreed, ladling stew into a bowl. But others might surprise you. Father Mackenzie stopped by my place yesterday, asked a lot of questions about you and the baby. Jacob's head snapped up. What kind of questions? Good questions. About whether you were treating her well, whether she seemed healthy and happy. I told him the truth, that you're doing your best but you need help. Before Jacob could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it was gentler, almost apologetic. Through the window, Jacob could see Father Mackenzie himself, his black coat stark against the white snow. The priest was a young man, perhaps 30, with kind eyes and a soft Irish accent that made even his sermons sound like lullabies. "Father," Jacob said as he opened the door, noting the way the priest's eyes immediately went to Sarah. "Jacob, Mrs. Vasquez." Father Mackenzie nodded to them both. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I wanted to see how you were managing." "We're managing fine," Jacob said, though the words lacked conviction. Father Mackenzie's eyes took in the state of the cabin, the exhaustion on Jacob's face, the way Eleanor was quietly taking over the kitchen duties. "I can see that," he said diplomatically. "Actually, I came to make a proposal. The church has been discussing your situation and we'd like to help." Jacob's expression hardened. "If this is about taking her to some mission school—" "It's not," Father Mackenzie interrupted gently. "It's about helping you care for her properly. There are women in the congregation who would be willing to help with childcare, to teach you what you need to know about raising a daughter." "Which women?" Jacob asked suspiciously, "because if it's Mrs. Patterson and her crowd, they'd probably try to convince me to give her up the first chance they got." "Mrs. Patterson is not among them," Father Mackenzie said with a slight smile, "but Elena here has volunteered, and so has Mary Crowfeather." Jacob's eyebrows rose. Mary Crowfeather was a mixed-blood woman who worked as a translator at the fort, caught between two worlds much like Sarah would be. She lived on the outskirts of town, accepted by neither the white community nor the various tribes, but respected for her skills and her fierce independence. "Mary wants to help?" Jacob asked. "She says the baby will need to know both sides of her heritage," Father Mackenzie explained. "She's offered to teach her about her Comanche roots, to help her understand where she comes from without shame." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "A child should know her history, all of it." Jacob looked down at Sarah, who was staring up at him with those dark, intelligent eyes. He'd been so focused on protecting her from the world that he hadn't thought much about what kind of world he was creating for her. A world where she only knew one side of herself, where her heritage was something to be hidden rather than honored. "There's something else," Father Mackenzie said quietly. "I received word from Fort Griffin yesterday. There's a Comanche band asking questions about a missing child, a baby girl who disappeared during a raid 3 weeks ago." Jacob's blood ran cold. "They're looking for her. Her uncle, apparently. A war chief named Running Bear. He's been asking the traders if they've heard anything about a baby with a beaded blanket." The silence in the cabin was deafening. Jacob could hear his own heartbeat, could feel Sarah's small body warm against his chest. He'd known this moment would come eventually, but he'd hoped for more time. "What do you think I should do?" he asked quietly. "I think," Father Mackenzie said carefully, "that you should consider meeting with them, not to give her up but to talk, to explain your intentions. Maybe there's a way to honor both her heritage and your promise." Eleanor set down her ladle with a sharp clink. "Or maybe there's a way to get you both killed. You think a Comanche war chief is going to listen to reason from a white man who's taken one of their children?" "I think," Father Mackenzie said, "that Jacob won't have peace until he tries, and neither will that little girl." Jacob looked out the window at the snow-covered landscape, thinking about the promise he'd made at the massacre site. No more blood. But how could he keep that promise if Sarah's own family was searching for her? How could he deny her the right to know her people? "I need time to think," he said finally. "Of course," Father Mackenzie said, "but don't take too long. Word is they're planning to come to Cedar Ridge themselves if they don't get answers soon." As the priest left, Elena continued her work in the kitchen, humming softly under her breath. Jacob sat with Sarah, watching the snow fall outside his window and wondering if he'd made a promise he couldn't keep. The morning was deceptively peaceful when Mary Crowfeather arrived at Jacob's cabin, her horse's hooves crunching softly in the fresh snow. She was a woman of perhaps 35, with long black hair streaked with premature gray and eyes that held the wisdom of someone who had seen too much. Her mixed heritage was evident in her features, the high cheekbones of her Comanche mother, the lighter skin of her Scottish father. "They're coming," she said without preamble, as Jacob opened the door. "Running Bear and 3 warriors. They'll be here within the hour." Jacob's grip tightened on Sarah, who was awake and alert in his arms. "How do you know?" "Because I told them where to find you," Mary said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of her admission. "And because I convinced them to come in peace, to talk first instead of taking the child by force." "You what?" Jacob's voice was dangerously quiet. Mary stepped into the cabin, her movements fluid and confident. "I've been watching this situation for weeks, Jacob Stone. Watching you struggle with a promise that's tearing you apart. The child needs to know her people, and her people need to know she's safe." "She is safe," Jacob said. "She's with me. For now," Mary replied. "But what happens when she's older? When she starts asking questions about who she is, where she comes from? What happens when the other children call her names, or when she looks in the mirror and wonders why she doesn't look like her father?" Jacob had no answer for that. He'd been so focused on protecting Sarah from immediate danger that he hadn't thought far enough ahead to consider the questions Mary was raising. "Running Bear is her blood," Mary continued. "Her father's brother. He's been searching for her since the raid, blaming himself for not protecting her mother." "Her mother was at the raid?" Jacob asked. "She was married to one of the warriors, young, barely 16. She died in the fighting, but not before hiding the baby where she thought she'd be safe." Mary's voice softened. "The family thinks the baby died too. Running Bear is the only one who refused to give up hope." The sound of approaching horses cut through the morning air. Jacob moved to the window and saw them, 4 riders silhouetted against the white landscape, moving with the fluid grace of men who had spent their lives in the saddle. Even at a distance, he could see the paint on their faces, the weapons at their sides, the way they rode with the confidence of warriors who feared nothing. "What do they want?" Jacob asked. "To see that she's alive and well," Mary said. "To understand why a white man would risk everything to save a Comanche child. To decide if you're worthy of the trust they're about to place in you." "Trust?" Mary smiled grimly. "You didn't think this would be simple, did you? They could have come in force, taken the child, and disappeared into the plains. Instead, they're coming to talk. That's not a Comanche tradition, it's a leap of faith." The riders drew closer, and Jacob could make out more details. The man in the lead was tall and lean, his face marked with the scars of old battles. He wore a magnificent war bonnet, and his horse was painted with symbols that Jacob didn't recognize, but somehow understood, spoke of power and loss. "That's Running Bear," Mary said. "The others are his nephews, White Eagle, Iron Horse, and the young one is Spotted Wolf." Jacob's hand moved instinctively to his gun, then stopped. He looked down at Sarah, who was staring up at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything. "No more blood," he whispered to her. "That's what I promised you." The riders stopped 50 yards from the cabin, their horses stamping and snorting in the cold air. Running Bear raised his hand in what might have been a greeting or a signal, and Jacob realized they were waiting for him to come out. "I should go to them," he said. "We should go to them," Mary corrected. "I'm your translator, and they're more likely to listen if I'm there." Jacob wrapped Sarah more tightly in her blanket, checked that his gun was secure but not threatening, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he walked steadily toward the waiting warriors, Mary at his side. Running Bear dismounted when they were 10 feet away, his movements deliberate and controlled. Up close, Jacob could see the grief in the man's eyes, the way his gaze fixed immediately on the bundle in Jacob's arms. The war chief spoke in rapid Comanche, his voice deep and musical. Mary translated, "He says he knows that bundle. It belonged to his sister, Gentle Dawn. He wants to know if the child inside is his blood." Jacob shifted Sarah so that her face was visible. Running Bear's breath caught and he took a step forward, his hand extended as if he wanted to touch her but didn't dare. "Tell him her name is Sarah," Jacob said. "Tell him she's been safe and cared for," Mary translated, and Running Bear's response was longer, more emotional. "He says she has her mother's eyes. He says her Comanche name is Morning Star, and that she is the daughter of his heart, now that her parents are dead." "Tell him I understand," Jacob said. "Tell him I found her alone and cold and I promised to protect her." More rapid conversation in Comanche, with all 4 warriors participating now. Jacob caught a few words that Mary had taught him. White man, promise, blood, but the overall meaning was lost to him. "They're debating," Mary said quietly. "Running Bear wants to take her back to the tribe. The others are arguing about whether they can trust you, whether she's better off with her people or with someone who's already proven he'll protect her." Sarah chose that moment to make one of her small sounds, a soft cooing that carried clearly in the cold air. Running Bear's face transformed, the hard lines of the warrior softening into something almost tender. He spoke again, this time directly to Jacob, his words measured and formal. Mary's translation came slowly. He says you have done something he did not expect from a white man. You have loved a child who is not your blood, protected her when it would have been easier to let her die. He says, this is the way of the people, to care for all children as if they were our own. Tell him I want to keep caring for her, Jacob said. Tell him I'll teach her about both worlds, his and mine. The conversation that followed was intense, with all 4 warriors speaking at once. Jacob watched Running Bear's face, trying to read the emotions that flickered across it. Finally, the war chief held up his hand for silence. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with the weight of decision. Mary's translation came in careful, precise English. He says the child will stay with you, but she will also be part of his family. He will come to visit her, to teach her the ways of the people. When she is old enough, she will choose for herself where she belongs. And if she chooses to stay with me? Jacob asked. Then she stays, Mary translated. But she will always be Comanche, and she will always be welcome among the people. Running Bear stepped forward and placed his hand on Jacob's shoulder, speaking directly to him in broken English. You, good man, keep Morning Star safe. Keep promise. I will, Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. I give you my word. The war chief nodded, then turned to Sarah one more time. He spoke to her in Comanche, his voice gentle and full of love. Mary didn't translate, but Jacob understood it was a blessing, a prayer, a promise from one guardian to another. As the warriors mounted their horses and prepared to leave, Running Bear called out one last time. Mary's translation was simple. He says they will be watching, not to threaten you, but to protect you both. The child now has 2 families, and both will defend her. Jacob stood in the snow holding Sarah close, watching the riders disappear into the distance. For the first time since he'd found her, he felt like he might actually be able to keep his promise. No more blood, but perhaps finally some peace. 2 years had passed since the confrontation with Running Bear, and Cedar Ridge had settled into an uneasy but functional peace. Sarah, or Morning Star as she was known to her Comanche family, had grown into a bright, curious toddler who spoke her first words in both English and Comanche. She had Jacob's quiet determination and her mother's quick intelligence, and she had somehow managed to wrap the entire town around her tiny fingers. Jacob stood on the porch of his cabin, watching as Sarah played in the yard with a wooden horse that Running Bear had carved for her during his last visit. The war chief came every few months, always announced by Mary Crow Feather, always bringing gifts and stories from the tribe. The visits had become easier over time, even anticipated by some of the townspeople who had initially been terrified of seeing Comanche warriors on their streets. She's getting big, Elena Vasquez said, climbing the steps to the porch with a basket of fresh bread. Over the past 2 years, she had become something of a grandmother to Sarah, teaching her Spanish songs and helping Jacob navigate the complexities of raising a daughter. Too big, Jacob replied, though his voice held more pride than complaint. Running Bear says she's ready to learn to ride properly, wants to give her a pony. Elena laughed. And what did you tell him? That she's barely 2 years old, Jacob said. But I think I'm fighting a losing battle. She's got her mother's spirit and her uncle's stubbornness. A cloud of dust on the horizon caught Jacob's attention. A single rider was approaching at a gallop, and even at a distance, Jacob could see the urgency in the way the horse was being pushed. As the rider drew closer, he recognized young Billy Hawkins, the same boy who had stood with Marcus Crenshaw that first day in town. Billy pulled up his horse in a spray of dirt and snow, his face flushed with excitement and fear. Jacob, you got to come quick. There's been shooting at the Hendricks place, Comanche raiders, they say. Mr. Crenshaw's gathering a posse. Jacob's blood ran cold. Sarah looked up from her play, sensing the tension in the air. What kind of shooting, Billy? Don't know for sure, Billy said, his words tumbling over each other. But old man Hendricks is dead, and his cattle are gone. Crenshaw says it's time to teach them savages a lesson once and for all. Elena cursed in Spanish, gathering Sarah up into her arms. This is what we've been afraid of, she said to Jacob. One incident and all the progress we've made will be lost. Jacob was already moving toward the barn, his mind racing. If Crenshaw led a posse against the Comanche, it would mean war. And if Running Bear's people were involved, it would mean Sarah would be caught in the middle of a conflict between her 2 families. Billy, Jacob called out, you tell Crenshaw to wait. Tell him I'm coming and I want to talk to him before he does anything stupid. He ain't gonna listen to you, Jacob, Billy said. He's been saying all along that keeping that baby was gonna lead to trouble. Now he's got his proof. She's not proof of anything, Jacob said sharply, saddling Flint with practiced speed. She's a child and she's got nothing to do with what happened to Hendricks. But as he rode toward town, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that everything he'd built over the past 2 years was about to come crashing down. The fragile peace between the town and the Comanche, the acceptance that Sarah had slowly won from the community, the promise he'd made to keep her safe, all of it hung in the balance. He found the posse gathering outside the cattleman's saloon, 20 men armed with rifles and righteous anger. Marcus Crenshaw was in the center of it all, his face red with fury as he outlined his plan to track down the raiders and make them pay. "Stone!" Crenshaw called out as Jacob approached. "Come to join us, have you? About time you showed some loyalty to your own kind." "I've come to stop you from making a mistake," Jacob replied, dismounting and facing the assembled men. "You don't know who attacked Hendricks. Could have been renegades, could have been white men trying to stir up trouble. Hell, could have been anyone." "It was Comanche," Crenshaw said with certainty. "Tracks don't lie, and neither do the arrows we found in Hendricks' back." "Even if it was Comanche," Jacob said, "it wasn't Running Bear's people. They've been keeping the peace." "Peace?" Crenshaw laughed bitterly. "You call this peace? A man's dead, his cattle stolen, and you want to talk about peace?" "I want to talk about not starting a war over one raid," Jacob said. "I want to talk about giving diplomacy a chance before we all start shooting." Sheriff Brennan stepped forward, his face troubled. "Jacob's got a point, Marcus. Maybe we should send word to the fort. Let the army handle this." "The army's 3 days away," Crenshaw snapped. "By the time they get here, the trail will be cold and the raiders will be long gone. We need to act now while we can still track them." Jacob looked around at the faces of the men in the posse. Some he recognized as hotheads, who had always been eager for a fight. Others were good men, family men, who were motivated by fear rather than hatred. These were the ones he might be able to reach. "I know most of you," Jacob said, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "I know you're scared, and I know you want to protect your families. But think about what you're doing. You're talking about riding out and attacking people who might be completely innocent of this crime. You're talking about starting a cycle of violence that won't end until a lot of good people are dead." "Like Hendricks?" someone called out. "Yes, like Hendricks," Jacob agreed. "And like your sons and your brothers, and maybe even your daughters if this thing escalates the way these things always do." Father Mackenzie emerged from the crowd, his young face grave. "Jacob's right. Violence begets violence. We need to think this through." "Thinking's gotten us nowhere," Crenshaw said. "It's time for action." Before anyone could respond, another rider appeared on the horizon. This one was moving at a more measured pace, and as he drew closer, Jacob recognized the familiar figure of Mary Crow Feather. She was leading a second horse, and on that horse was Running Bear himself. A murmur ran through the crowd as the two riders approached. Several men reached for their weapons, but Jacob stepped forward, his hand raised. "Let them speak," he said. "Let them explain what happened." Running Bear dismounted with his usual dignity, his eyes taking in the assembled posse with no sign of fear. He spoke to Mary in Comanche, and she translated his words for the crowd. "He says he knows about the attack on the Hendricks place," Mary announced. "He says it was not his people who did this thing. He says he can prove it." "Prove it how?" Crenshaw demanded. Running Bear reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a collection of arrows. He laid them on the ground in front of the posse, then spoke again in Comanche. "These arrows were found near the Hendricks place," Mary translated. "But they are not Comanche arrows. See the markings, the way they are made. These are Kiowa arrows from a renegade band that has been raiding both white settlements and Comanche camps." Jacob knelt to examine the arrows, noting the subtle differences in their construction. "He's right," he said. "These aren't the same as the arrows I've seen Running Bear's people use." "How do we know he's telling the truth?" Crenshaw asked. "How do we know this isn't just some trick?" Running Bear spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Mary's translation was immediate. "He says his word is his bond. He says if the white men want proof, they can come to his camp and see for themselves that all his warriors are accounted for. He says he will ride with them to track the real raiders." The silence that followed was profound. Jacob could see the uncertainty in the faces of the posse members, the way they looked to each other for guidance. "I'll go," Jacob said finally. "I'll ride with Running Bear and help track the real raiders, but I want the rest of you to wait here, to give us a chance to bring back the truth." "The hell you will," Crenshaw said. "You're not going anywhere with that savage." "He's not a savage," Jacob said quietly. "He's a man trying to prevent a war, just like I am." Sheriff Brennan stepped forward. "I'll deputize you, Jacob. Make it official. You and Running Bear track the raiders. Bring back proof of who really did this. The rest of us will wait here for word." It took 3 days of hard riding, but they found the renegade camp hidden in a box canyon 20 miles south of Cedar Ridge. The Kiowa raiders had grown careless, confident that their attack would be blamed on the Comanche. They still had Hendrix's cattle, and they still had the clothes they'd stripped from his body. The capture was swift and decisive. Running Bear's warriors surrounded the camp, while Jacob and 2 deputies moved in from the front. There was no bloodshed. The raiders surrendered when they realized they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. When they returned to Cedar Ridge with the real killers, the town erupted in celebration. But Jacob felt no triumph, only relief that his promise had held. No more blood, at least not today. That evening, as he sat on his porch watching Sarah play, Running Bear approached on foot. The war chief had removed his war paint and weapons, and he moved with the easy grace of a man at peace. "You kept your word," Running Bear said in his careful English. "No more blood." "We kept our word," Jacob corrected. "All of us." Running Bear nodded, then knelt down to Sarah's level. She ran to him with a delighted squeal, and he lifted her high in the air, speaking to her in Comanche. When he set her down, she ran to Jacob and climbed into his lap. "She is lucky," Running Bear said. "She has 2 fathers who love her, 2 families who will protect her. She will grow up knowing that peace is possible." Jacob looked around at his small world, the cabin he'd built with his own hands, the town that had slowly learned to accept him and Sarah, the friends who had stood by him when things got difficult. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was good. "She'll grow up knowing that promises can be kept," Jacob said, holding Sarah close. "That's the most important thing." As the sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jacob Stone reflected on the promise he'd made to a baby girl in the snow. No more blood. It had seemed impossible at the time, but somehow, with the help of unexpected allies and the power of love, he'd managed to keep it. And in keeping that promise, he'd found something he hadn't been looking for: a family, a community, and a peace that went deeper than the absence of violence. He'd found a home.